Humanity was supposed to be the galaxy's janitors, meek scavengers tolerated only for our ability to do the dirty work no one else wanted. Everyone laughed, right up until the moment Charles cleared the ash off a buried Titan on Tartarus 9. He didn't just find a derelict warship, he unearthed a dormant god of iron and hate. As 3 miles of UED dreadnought roared back to life, the stars themselves seemed to dim. The scavengers were no longer bottom feeders. They were the apex predators. Tartarus 9 wasn't a planet, it was an ashtray. Charles dragged his left boot forward, the magnetic sole engaging with a dull, heavy clack against the basalt bedrock hidden beneath a foot of gray, pulverized silicate. The wind howled, a constant abrasive scream that sounded like tearing metal. It threw handfuls of razor-sharp dust against the faceplate of his hard suit, scratching the already scuffed polymer. He paused, leaning into the gale. His chest heaved. The rebreather strapped to his back let out a pathetic wheeze, cycling air that tasted of copper and stale sweat. "Battery at 12%, the suit's automated voice chimed. It lacked inflection, just a flat, deadpan reminder of his impending mortality. Yeah, I know," Charles muttered. His voice was raspy, throat parched. He tapped the side of his helmet, bringing up the HUD. The green lines flickered, struggling against the intense atmospheric radiation. A blinking yellow dot pulsed at the edge of his vision. The anomaly. He had been tracking it for 3 days. A magnetic ghost. The local alien syndicates, mostly scale-skinned Krillari who ran the mining operations on the equator, didn't bother scanning the polar regions. Too cold, too much interference. But Charles was desperate. He owed 50,000 credits to a loan shark on Outpost Delta, and his ship, a rust bucket hauler he affectionately called the Tin Can, barely had enough thrust to break atmosphere. If this anomaly was just another deposit of oxidized iron, he was a dead man. He'd either freeze here when his suit died, or he'd get his kneecaps inverted by a Krillari enforcer next week. "Come on," he grunted, dragging his right foot forward. Clack. Behind him, a heavy-tracked drone trudged through the ash. It was a blocky, ugly thing, basically a motorized wheelbarrow with a rudimentary pathfinding chip. Charles called it Mule. Mule carried his plasma cutter, a few rations, and a heavy-duty winch. The yellow dot on the HUD merged with the center reticle. He was standing right on top of it. Charles looked around. Nothing. Just swirling gray dunes and jagged rock formations fading into the gloom. "You've got to be kidding me." He dropped to his knees. The impact sent a puff of fine dust into the storm. He pulled a hand scanner from his belt, wiping the dust off its screen with a thick, insulated glove. The needle pinned itself to the far right. Maximum density, maximum magnetic resonance. It was right beneath him. Charles signaled Mule. The drone clanked forward, stopping a few feet away. He unclipped a collapsible, entrenching tool from the drone's side, locked the spade into place, and started digging. It was brutal work. The ash was dense, heavy with heavy metals and frozen moisture. His breath fogged his visor with every exertion. Minutes bled into hours. The suit warned him. Battery at 9%. His shovel hit something. It didn't yield like rock. It didn't crunch like ice. It rang, a deep, resonant thud that vibrated up the shaft of the shovel and rattled Charles's teeth. He froze. He dropped the shovel and fell to his hands and knees, frantically sweeping the dirt away with his heavy gloves. The gray ash parted. Underneath, There was no rock. There was metal. It was dark, almost black, but it caught the dim light of his shoulder lamp with a dull, matte sheen. It was perfectly smooth, too smooth for natural formation. He cleared a patch the size of a dinner table. It curved, ever so slightly, sloping downward into the frozen earth. Charles pulled a chemical flare from his harness, cracked it, and held it close. The red light washed over the surface. There were lines, seams, perfectly machined grooves tightly sealed together. He followed one of the seams, crawling on his belly through the dirt until he hit an indentation. A groove cut deep into the metal, then another. He sat back on his heels, his heart hammering against his ribs. The coal didn't matter anymore. The failing battery didn't matter. He was looking at a letter, a massive blocky letter carved into the hull, filled with a millennium of compacted dirt. He recognized the font. Every human child who grew up in the orbital slums knew that font from the old history vids. It was an A. He scrambled further down the hull, digging wildly with his hands. An E, then a G, a EGIS. God Almighty, Charles whispered. He stood up, stumbling back a few paces. He looked at the gentle curve of the metal, extrapolating the geometry in his mind. He looked out into the howling dust storm, realizing that the hill he had been using as a landmark for the last 5 miles wasn't a hill. It was the main thruster cowling. This wasn't a crashed fighter. This wasn't a derelict freighter. Charles was standing on the back of a United Earth Directorate dreadnought. A myth. A ghost story. 300 years ago, the UED threw everything they had against the Concordat Armada in the Orion Spur. Humanity lost. The fleet was scattered, broken, or captured. The Concordat made sure humans knew their place ever since, as second-class citizens, tolerated laborers, and junk peddlers. But they never accounted for the Aegis-class dreadnoughts. History said they were destroyed in the shipyards. History was a liar. One was right here, buried under the dust of a dead world, sleeping. "Mule!" Charles's voice trembled, raw with adrenaline and awe. "Get the plasma cutter. We're going in." Finding a door on a 3-mile-long warship buried under 50 feet of ash was like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. Charles didn't have time to look for an airlock. His suit battery was at 7%. The ambient temperature was dropping as Tartarus 9 rotated away from its distant, anemic sun. He had to make his own door. He chose a spot near what he guessed was the upper dorsal ridge, hoping to intersect a maintenance corridor rather than a solid bulkhead or a munitions depot. Mule rolled up, offering the heavy industrial plasma torch. Charles grabbed it. The tool was unwieldy, designed for cutting apart scrapped freighters in 0G, not for precise work in a gravity well while fighting a hurricane. He engaged the magnetic clamps on his boots to root himself to the hull. He squeezed the trigger. A blinding blue-white flame erupted from the nozzle. The heat was instantaneous and fierce, pushing back the biting cold. Charles pressed the flame against the black metal. Sparks showered over his visor. The metal hissed, but it didn't melt. "Come on," he grunted, leaning his weight into the torch. "You're old, you're brittle. Give way." The metal didn't care. It was UED battle plate, designed to take direct hits from plasma torpedoes and railgun slugs. A handheld salvage torch was an insult. 10 minutes passed. His arms screamed with fatigue. The torch's fuel cell was draining fast. The hull was glowing a dull cherry red, but it wasn't yielding. Battery at 5%. Warning, core temperature dropping. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his adrenaline. If he couldn't get through this hull, he would freeze to death kneeling on the greatest discovery in human history. It was a cosmic joke. The Concordate would probably find his frozen corpse in a decade, scrape him off the hull, and claim the ship for themselves. "No," Charles snarled. He adjusted the torch, narrowing the beam to a pinprick, increasing the intensity to maximum. The torch began to whine, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that vibrated through his gloves. It was dangerous. It could explode. He didn't care. He focused the beam on a single millimeter of the glowing red metal. He held it there. Sweat stung his eyes, but he couldn't wipe them. The whine of the torch grew louder, drowning out the wind. Pop! A tiny jet of superheated gas blew back, splashing against his chest plate. He grunted in pain, but kept the torch steady. He had punctured it. A hole no wider than a needle, but a hole. Slowly, agonizingly, he dragged the torch downward, slicing a millimeter at a time. It took 40 minutes to cut an oval, just big enough for him to squeeze his shoulders through. The torch sputtered, coughed, and died. Empty. Charles dropped it. He grabbed a heavy crowbar from Mule, wedged it into the glowing cut, and threw his entire body weight backward. The metal groaned. It fought him, but the structural integrity was compromised. With a deafening, tearing screech, the oval plate peeled back. Immediately, air rushed out of the hole. A violent hiss of equalizing pressure. It blasted Charles with a cloud of ancient, stale dust. He didn't wait. He grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight off his belt, detached the safety line from Mule, and squeezed through the jagged opening. The metal was still blisteringly hot. It scorched the outer layer of his suit, filling his nose with the smell of burnt polymer. He fell forward, tumbling into absolute darkness. He hit a metal floor hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Silence. It was absolute. After hours of the wind screaming in his ears, the sudden lack of noise was deafening. There was only the harsh, ragged sound of his own breathing inside his helmet. He clicked on the flashlight. A stark white beam cut through the gloom. Dust motes, undisturbed for a millennium, danced lazily in the light. He was in a maintenance shaft, cramped, utilitarian, lined with thick bundles of dormant cabling and frost-covered pipes. He pushed himself up, wincing at the bruise forming on his shoulder. He checked his suit's external sensors. "Atmosphere, breathable," he whispered, staring at the readout. "High nitrogen, low oxygen, but no toxins. Pressure is stable." He reached up, hesitated for a fraction of a second, and broke the seal on his helmet. There was a soft hiss as the helmet detached. Charles pulled it off and took a deep breath. The air was cold, dry, and tasted strongly of ozone, old machine oil, and something else. Something faint and metallic. Blood. He attached the helmet to his belt and moved forward, sweeping the beam of his flashlight back and forth. The silence was heavy, oppressive. This wasn't just a machine, it was a tomb. He reached the end of the shaft and found a manual override wheel on a heavy blast door. The metal was cold enough to bite through his gloves. He braced his boots against the bulkhead and hauled on the wheel. Rust cracked. The wheel screamed in protest, but it turned. Inch by inch. He pulled the door open and stepped through. The flashlight beam swept across a vast cavernous space. This was a main corridor. It was wide enough to drive a heavy transport truck down. The walls were lined with dormant lumen strips and heavy blast doors. But it wasn't empty. Charles stopped dead. The beam rested on a barricade. It was made of overturned cargo crates, torn metal plating, and heavy engineering tools welded together in a desperate, haphazard fashion. And scattered across the barricade, lying where they fell, were the defenders, skeletons, dozens of them, still clad in the tattered, faded remnants of UED uniforms. Some held ancient kinetic rifles, others held heavy wrenches. Charles walked forward slowly, his boots ringing hollow on the deck plating. The air here was drier, preserving the dead. They hadn't died in a vacuum. There were no scorch marks on the walls from plasma fire. No signs of alien boarding parties. He knelt next to a figure, slumped against a crate. The skeleton was small, a woman, judging by the bone structure. She held a heavy revolver, the barrel resting against the floor. Pinned to the shreds of her tunic was a tarnished silver bar. Charles reached out and wiped the dust off it. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Chief Engineer. He looked down the massive corridor, stretching into the dark, swallowed by shadows. There was no battle damage, no hull breaches. They hadn't been killed by the Concordat. "What happened to you?" he whispered to the empty air. They had barricaded themselves in. They had fought something, or kept something out, but the ship was whole. Charles stood up. He didn't have time to play archaeologist. His suit battery was practically dead, which meant he was losing his primary heat source. The ambient temperature inside the ship was hovering near freezing. He needed to find power. He needed the engineering bay. He looked at the skeletal remains of Lieutenant Commander Hayes, then at the direction she had been defending. The barricade was built to stop something coming from the front of the ship. They were protecting the rear, protecting the engines. "Sorry, Commander," Charles said softly, stepping carefully over the remains. "I'm going to need to borrow your ship." It took Charles 2 hours to navigate the labyrinth of the dreadnought's lower decks. The ship was a city of steel, silent and frozen. He passed through cavernous mess halls with plates still sitting on tables, hydroponic bays where the plants had long ago turned to gray ash, and medical wards filled with empty, frost-covered beds. The sense of isolation was crushing. He was walking through the graveyard of his own species' golden age. Every bulkhead, every faded warning sign written in English, was a sharp reminder of what humanity had lost. He finally reached the primary engineering bay. The blast doors here were immense, 3 feet thick and locked tight, but there was a manual maintenance hatch off to the side. Charles forced it open and slipped through. He stood on a catwalk, looking down into a vast cylindrical chamber. This was the heart of the beast. 3 massive fusion reactors sat in the center of the room, encased in heavy shielding. They looked like dormant metal volcanoes. Thick cables, thick as ancient tree trunks, snaked from the reactors into the walls, carrying the lifeblood of the ship. It was entirely dark, save for his sweeping flashlight beam. Charles descended a rusted spiral staircase to the main floor. The temperature here was marginally warmer, perhaps a few degrees above freezing. The sheer mass of the dormant reactor cores held onto residual thermal energy, even after 1,000 years. He moved toward the primary control console, a massive semicircle of glass and steel facing the reactors. It was dead. No lights, no hum. Charles dropped his heavy pack onto the deck. He pulled out a portable diagnostic terminal, a jury-rigged piece of tech he used to crack the security on abandoned freighters. He popped the casing off the main console, revealing a dense nest of fiber optics and copper wiring. "All right," he muttered, pulling a set of jumper cables from his pack. "Let's see if you still have a pulse." He clamped the cables onto the primary power bus of the console and hooked the other end to the heavy, high-yield battery he had salvaged from Mule before leaving the drone outside. It was a risk. If the ship's systems were shorted out, he could blow his own battery, leaving him completely in the dark. He flipped the breaker on the battery. A sharp spark jumped from the terminal. Charles flinched back. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, deep within the bowels of the console, a faint, high-pitched whine began. It was the sound of capacitors charging. A single amber light blinked on the console, then another. The glass surface of the terminal flickered. Static danced across the screen, resolving slowly into blocky, low-resolution text. "Warning. Main power offline. Warning, life support critical. Warning, cryogenic suspension failed." Charles let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. The system was alive. Barely, but alive. He tapped the screen. It was unresponsive. He wiped a layer of grime off the glass and tried again. Still nothing. Biometrics, he realized. The system was locked down. A ship this advanced wouldn't just let anyone push buttons. He looked around. Beside the console was a flat, dark glass panel with the outline of a hand etched into it. Charles pulled off his right glove. His hand was trembling slightly from the cold and the adrenaline. He placed his bare palm flat against the cold glass. A red laser swept across his hand. Biometric scan initiated. The console hummed louder. The screen flashed red. DNA profile. Unrecognized. Warning. Unauthorized access. Charles swore. Of course his DNA wasn't recognized. He wasn't military. He was a junk rat born on a space station orbiting a gas giant. "Come on," he pleaded, keeping his hand on the glass. "Read the base pair. Read the genome." The screen flashed red again. "Analyzing genomic markers." Charles held his breath. The Concordat used biolocks that immediately incinerated intruders if the DNA didn't match. He had no idea what the UED did. The red light vanished. The screen turned a cool pale blue. Genomic match. Homo sapiens. Status. Civilian. Override protocol. Omega Winter. Active. Welcome. The terminal lit up like a Christmas tree. Hundreds of holographic displays projected into the air around Charles, bathing the dark engineering bay in a ghostly blue glow. Schematics of the ship, damage reports, inventory lists, and tactical overlays scrolled past faster than he could read. Charles stared, mesmerized. The sheer volume of data was staggering. He reached out and tapped a prompt that read, "Auxiliary power." The system asked for confirmation. He pressed yes. Deep beneath his feet, something moved. It wasn't a sound at first, but a vibration. A heavy rhythmic thrumming that resonated through the soles of his boots and into his bones. It felt like a heartbeat. Thrum, thrum, thrum. The sound grew louder. The grinding of massive gears, the rush of pressurized fluids surging through dry pipes. The engineering bay began to shake. Dust shook loose from the ceiling, raining down around him. Suddenly, a row of massive floodlights near the ceiling snapped on, blindingly bright. They cascaded down the length of the bay, illuminating the massive reactors in stark white light. Charles shielded his eyes, laughing a ragged, breathless laugh. He turned back to the console. The main holographic display had stabilized. It showed a wireframe model of the dreadnought. UES Vanguard. Class: Forged Dreadnought. Status: Awakening. Forged Dreadnought, Charles read aloud. He frowned. He knew the history. Dreadnoughts were warships, massive guns, thick armor. He tapped the submenu for the ship's schematics. He bypassed the armories and the flight decks, scrolling down to the lower hull. His eyes widened. The bottom third of the ship wasn't engines or cargo. It was a factory. A fully automated molecular-scale fabrication facility. The schematic showed colossal scoops designed to strip mine asteroids, feeding raw material into matter converters. The ship wasn't just built to fight a war. It was built to build the war. It could manufacture fighters, weapons, drones, and munitions on the fly. It was a self-sustaining mobile empire. Charles slumped into the heavy leather chair bolted in front of the console. The leather cracked under his weight, but it held. He stared at the blue holographic displays. He came here looking for a payday. He figured he'd find some salvageable tech, maybe strip some rare earth metals from the wiring, and pay off his debt. He thought he'd sell the location of the wreck to a Krillari warlord for enough credits to buy a ticket to the inner core worlds. He looked at the readout. Weapons. Online. Fabrication. Online. Hull integrity. 94%. He thought about the Concordat, the sleek, arrogant alien fleets that patrolled the space lanes, demanding tithes from human colonies, treating them like vermin. He thought about the loan shark waiting to break his legs. He thought about the dead crew outside the door, who had locked themselves in the dark so this ship would survive. Charles leaned forward. The cynicism that had kept him alive for 30 years, the instinct to take the money and run, slowly melted away under the glow of the blue holograms. He placed his hands on the console. "System," Charles said, his voice steadying. A synthetic voice, crisp and clean, echoed through the vast engineering bay. "Awaiting command." Charles grinned. It was a sharp, dangerous expression. "Warm up the main reactors. We're breaking orbit." The console vibrated under Charles's hands, no longer a dead relic, but a living, breathing beast waking from a millennium of hibernation. The deep, rhythmic thrum of the primary fusion reactors escalated into a continuous, deafening roar. Dust rained from the high ceilings of the engineering bay in thick gray sheets. The temperature in the room was rising rapidly. The bone-chilling cold that had nearly killed him an hour ago was replaced by the dry, static-charged heat of massive power generation. Charles coughed, waving the dust away from his face as he stared at the primary tactical display. The wireframe projection of the UES Vanguard was shifting colors. Modules that had been black and dormant for centuries were lighting up in vibrant, angry amber. Reactor 1, nominal. Reactor 2, nominal. Reactor 3, initiating plasma injection. A synthetic voice, stripped of all emotion and entirely devoid of the conversational inflections common in modern civilian tech, filled the cavernous room. Warning: primary thrust initiation impossible. Terrestrial obstruction detected on dorsal, port, and starboard axes. Hull integrity at risk if launch sequence continues. "Yeah, I know," Charles muttered. He was buried under 50 feet of compacted ash, basalt, and ice. You didn't just fly a 3-mile-long dreadnought out of the dirt like a speeder bike. The sheer mass of the Earth above them would crush the ship the moment the inertial dampeners engaged. He frantically swiped through the holographic menus, his grease-stained fingers leaving smudges on the glowing projections. He needed a shovel. A really, really big shovel. He bypassed the main thruster controls and delved into the defensive systems. System, locate the repulsor grid, the kinetic shielding. Kinetic barrier arrays are offline. Capacitors require 3 minutes to achieve optimal charge. Do it, Charles commanded. He leaned back in the creaking leather chair, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was operating a machine capable of turning a moon into gravel, and he was doing it with the equivalent of a learner's permit. The deck plates beneath his boots began to shudder violently. It wasn't the smooth vibration of the engines anymore. It was the violent, chaotic shaking of metal fighting against millions of tons of rock. Capacitors at 40%, the ship announced. On the surface of Tartarus 9, the eternal ash storm was violently interrupted. For centuries, the polar winds had swept across a relatively flat expanse of gray dunes. Now, the ground was swelling. A massive mound, 3 miles long and half a mile wide, pushed upward. Deep, jagged fissures spiderwebbed across the frozen earth. Massive slabs of basalt, some the size of city blocks, snapped and tilted toward the sky. The sound was apocalyptic, a low-frequency tearing that drowned out the howling wind. Capacitors at 80%. Warning, seismic pressure exceeding safety tolerances. Hold it together, you stubborn old bastard, Charles grunted, his eyes fixed on the hull integrity readouts. The amber lines were flashing red in the upper quadrants. The Earth was fighting back, trying to crush the Vanguard back into its grave. Capacitors at 100%. Charles didn't hesitate. Discharge, maximum omnidirectional burst. Inside the engineering bay, the lights flickered and dimmed as the dreadnought pulled massive amounts of power from the reactors. Outside, the ground exploded. A spherical shockwave of pure kinetic force erupted from the buried hull. It didn't burn or melt the Earth. It simply shoved it away with the force of a tectonic event. Millions of tons of ash, ice, and rock were violently ejected into the upper atmosphere. The explosion cleared a crater 4 miles wide, sending a shockwave through the atmosphere that shattered the local storm systems, creating a momentary, perfect circle of clear, starry sky above the impact zone. Charles was thrown against the heavy restraints of the command chair. His teeth clicked together hard enough to draw blood from his tongue. The engineering bay groaned, the metal screaming in protest, but the structural integrity fields held. The terrible shaking stopped. The deafening grind of rock against metal faded, replaced by the steady, powerful hum of the ship. Obstruction cleared, the system reported, its flat tone hilariously mismatched with the sheer violence of what it had just accomplished. Atmospheric exposure detected, inertial dampeners online, main thrusters available. Charles tasted copper. He spat a glob of blood onto the steel grating, a wild, manic grin spreading across his face. He looked at the external camera feeds projected on the main screen. The Vanguard was sitting in the center of a massive, smoking crater. The black armor of the hull, scrubbed clean of 1,000 years of dirt by the kinetic burst, gleamed under the harsh, blinding light of the dreadnought's own floodlights. It was majestic, It was terrifying. "System," Charles said, gripping the edge of the console. "Take us up, nice and slow. Let's see the sky." Deep in the stern, the primary anti-gravity drives engaged. The 3-mile-long slab of United Earth Directorate black iron defied the gravity well of Tartarus 9. It didn't lift off with a roar of fire. It rose with a sinister, silent grace, a mountain of metal simply deciding that gravity no longer applied to it. Charles watched the altimeter climb. 100 feet, 500 feet, 1,000. He was airborne. He was sitting on the bridge of a god, but gods rarely went unnoticed. A flashing red icon pinged in the upper right corner of the tactical display. "Warning," the ship chimed. "Inbound bogies detected. Suborbital trajectory. Designation: unknown." Charles sighed, his manic grin fading into a hard, cynical line. He tapped the icon, expanding the sensor data. 3 heavily armed atmospheric skiffs were burning hard toward his position, their engines leaving long, dirty contrails in the ash clouds. They were transmitting on an unencrypted local frequency. Charles knew that frequency. It belonged to the Krillari mining syndicate. The loan shark had sent the repo men. 300 miles south, at the equatorial mining camps, the seismic alarms had nearly shattered the reinforced glass of the syndicate's control tower. Braddock hated Tartarus 9. He hated the dust, he hated the cold, and he especially hated his employers. But the Krillari paid in pure, unrefined iridium, and Braddock had expensive habits. As the syndicate's chief enforcer and debt collector, it was his job to ensure the human scavengers met their quotas. When the sensors registered a Class 4 seismic event at the northern pole, followed by an energy spike that momentarily blinded their orbital satellites, Braddock assumed some idiot had cracked a buried plasma core. He loaded into a heavy assault skiff with a dozen Krillari mercenaries, hulking scale-plated thugs armed with rapid-fire rail repeaters. 2 escort skiffs flanked him. They were expecting to find a smoking crater and maybe some salvageable scrap from whichever fool had blown themselves up. "Boss," the Krillari pilot hissed, his bifurcated tongue flicking against his comms headset. "Target zone is 10 clicks out. Storm is gone." "What do you mean the storm is gone?" Braddock snapped, stepping into the cramped cockpit. He peered through the reinforced viewport. The pilot was right. The eternal gray hurricane that choked the poles had been violently pushed aside. There was a massive, circular void in the cloud cover, lit by the pale light of the distant sun. "Get us closer," Braddock ordered. "Whatever blew up, I want the scraps secured before the orbital patrols notice the flash." The skiffs crested a jagged ridge of black rock. Braddock raised his magnoculars to his eyes. He didn't see a crater. He didn't see a cracked plasma core. He saw a wall of black metal. Braddock lowered the magnoculars, his jaw going slack. The object was hovering 3,000 feet above the surface. It was so massive that Braddock's brain initially refused to process it as a vehicle. It looked like a floating city block, angular, brutal, and utterly lacking in the sleek, aesthetic curves of Concordat design. It bristled with heavy turrets, missile banks, and colossal communication spires. The exhaust from its anti-gravity drives distorted the air beneath it, turning the landscape into a shimmering, heated blur. "By the void," Braddock whispered. The blood drained from his face. That's a ghost ship. That's a UED dreadnought." "Boss," the pilot clicked, his voice edged with panic. "Sensors are failing. The radiation coming off that thing is frying our optics. Before Braddock could issue a retreat order, the skiff's comms console erupted in a burst of harsh static. The noise was so loud the Krillari pilot ripped his headset off, hissing in pain. The static resolved into a clear, terrifyingly calm human voice. "Attention approaching vessels. You are entering restricted airspace." Braddock recognized that voice. It was raspy, tired, and deeply cynical. It was the voice of the scavenger who owed him 50 grand. "Charles?" Braddock grabbed the comms mic, his knuckles white. "Charles, is that you in there? What the hell did you find?" There was a brief pause on the line. The heavy mechanical hum of the dreadnought could be heard bleeding through the open channel. "Braddock, I thought they might send you," Charles replied. There was no fear in his voice, none of the usual desperate groveling. "I'm going to have to ask you to turn around," Braddock sneered, his instinct for intimidation overriding his temporary awe. He was in a heavily armed gunship. Charles was a rat in a tin can. "You think finding a derelict makes you a king, Charles? That ship belongs to the syndicate now. It's on our claim. Power down whatever systems you accidentally turned on, open the airlocks, and maybe I won't skin you alive before I shoot you." "You're not listening, Braddock." "I'm giving you 10 seconds, rat," Braddock barked, gesturing for the pilot to arm the skiff's primary cannons. "Or we blow you out of the sky." Inside the engineering bay of the Vanguard, Charles sat back in the leather chair. He looked at the tactical display. The 3 Krillari skiffs were represented by 3 tiny, insignificant red dots hovering near the ship's massive portside bow. He sighed. He had spent his whole life running from men like Braddock, dodging blows, taking the scraps, keeping his head down so the galaxy wouldn't step on him. He wasn't running anymore. "System," Charles said smoothly. "Target the lead skiff." "Target locked," the synthetic voice replied. "Arm port side point defense battery. Firing solution. Non-lethal warning shot. Clip their wings." Braddock was counting down from 5 when the sky turned white. It wasn't a laser beam. It was a solid slug of depleted uranium, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light by the dreadnought's magnetic rails. It bypassed the skiff entirely, striking the atmosphere 10 feet above their canopy. The supersonic shockwave was devastating. The concussive force slammed the lead skiff downward, shearing off its upper sensor vanes and shattering the reinforced viewport. Alarm shrieked through the cockpit as the skiff went into a violent, uncontrolled spin. Braddock was thrown into the bulkhead, his shoulder popping out of its socket with a sickening crunch. He screamed, tasting blood, as the pilot frantically wrestled with the yoke, barely pulling them out of a fatal nosedive just a few hundred feet above the jagged rocks. The 2 escort skiffs immediately broke formation, banking hard and fleeing back toward the equator. The comms channel cracked open again. "I told you to turn around, Braddock," Charles's voice echoed through the sparking, smoke-filled cockpit of the crippled skiff. "Consider the 50,000 credits paid. If I see a Krillari ship on my scopes again, I won't miss." Braddock pulled himself up, clutching his dislocated arm. He stared through the shattered viewport at the massive black Leviathan slowly ascending toward the upper atmosphere. It was blotting out the sun. "He didn't just find a ship," Braddock choked out, his voice trembling with a mixture of agony and absolute terror. "He found an army." On the bridge of the Vanguard, Charles cut the comms link. He watched the single red dot limp away on the tactical map. He felt no remorse. The galaxy only respected one language, and humanity had just found its voice again. "System," Charles commanded, looking at the starry void waiting beyond the atmosphere. "Engage primary thrusters. Set course for the outer rim. It's time to see what this factory can build." Deep space was a different kind of quiet than the grave on Tartarus 9. It wasn't the silence of things suppressed by dirt. It was the absolute absence of anything at all. The Vanguard drifted through the outer fringes of the Oort cloud, a black shadow moving against a backdrop of distant, indifferent stars. Charles sat in the cavernous command center, dwarfed by the massive tactical displays. He was wrapped in a thick, wool-lined blanket he'd stripped from officers' quarters, nursing a cup of something the ship's ancient synthesizers claimed was coffee. It tasted like hot rust and burnt plastic. He drank it anyway. The ship was awake, but it was starving. The primary reactors were running on their baseline fusion reserves, and the hull integrity was severely compromised from the tectonic launch. The internal temperature had stabilized to a tolerable 60 degrees, but sections of the lower decks were still hard vacuum. If Charles wanted to survive out here, he needed to feed the ship. "System," Charles said, his voice echoing in the empty room. "Give me a deep-range mass sweep. Look for high concentrations of iron, nickel, and silicate. We need raw materials." "Scanning," the flat synthetic voice replied. A holographic grid materialized in the center of the room, washing Charles's tired face in pale blue light. A cluster of jagged shapes populated the display. "Dense asteroid field detected at bearing 049er. Composition: 70% ferrous metals, 20% frozen volatiles." "Take us in, minimum thrust. Let's not attract any deep space patrols." The Vanguard banked with glacial, terrifying momentum. Charles felt the subtle shift in artificial gravity, a heavy sinking sensation in his gut as millions of tons of dreadnought reoriented. When they reached the edge of the asteroid field, Charles bypassed the bridge controls and took the long walk down to the fabrication decks. He needed to see it for himself. The lower third of the Vanguard was an industrial nightmare. It lacked the clean, sterile aesthetics the Concordat favored. This was United Earth Directorate engineering, brutal, function over form, and built to take a beating. Massive blast doors opened into a cavernous bay that spanned nearly a mile of the ship's length. Conveyor belts the width of highways crisscrossed the floor, leading to colossal smelting furnaces and molecular stamping presses. It was pitch black, freezing, and dead. Charles walked to a railing overlooking the primary intake maw. He keyed his comms. "System, open the jaws, reel one in." Beneath the ship, massive armored plates retracted. The void of space rushed into the intake bay, contained only by a shimmering, translucent kinetic field. A pair of heavy magnetic grappling beams shot out into the dark. Charles watched as an asteroid the size of a commercial skyscraper was dragged from its orbit. The rock tumbled violently, but the magnetic beams held it in an iron grip, pulling it upward into the belly of the ship. It hit the kinetic field with a silent, blinding flash of displaced energy, then passed through into the pressurized intake bay. The noise was instantaneous and deafening. Colossal hydraulic crushers descended from the ceiling. They slammed into the asteroid with the force of a falling meteor. Rock shattered. Ice instantly sublimated into steam. The screech of tearing metal and crushing stone vibrated so intensely, Charles had to grip the railing to keep his balance. The crushed debris fell through heavy grates into the plasma furnaces below. The dark bay was suddenly bathed in the hellish, blinding light of liquid metal. Material processed, slag vented, raw ingots moving to fabrication queue, the system announced over the roar of the furnaces, awaiting manufacturing parameters. Charles wiped a layer of sweat and pulverized rock dust from his cheek. He pulled up a terminal on the walkway. He didn't know how to build a fighter jet, and he certainly didn't know how to build a warhead. But he knew how to read a catalog. He found the directory for maintenance drones, M-class automated repair units, heavy, blocky, and equipped with micro-welders and plasma torches. "Print me 50, Charles commanded, and send them to patch the dorsal armor." Deep within the factory, automated arms the size of construction cranes whirred to life. Sparks showered like rain as lasers cut through the freshly forged steel. It wasn't magic. It was math, heat, and violence. Within 20 minutes, the first drone dropped from a chute onto a conveyor belt. It hit the metal grate with a heavy clank, stood up on 4 hydraulic legs, and rotated its single red optical sensor toward Charles. It didn't beep or chirp. It just registered his biometric signature, turned around, and marched toward the nearest maintenance shaft. 49 more followed in lockstep. Charles watched them go, the heavy thud of their metallic feet echoing off the bulkheads. He had an army of ghosts and a factory that could build anything. He walked back toward the mess hall, his boots ringing on the deck. He stopped at a table where he had gathered a few personal effects found in the crew quarters. Among them was a battered datapad belonging to the skeleton he had found at the barricade. Lieutenant Commander Hayes. He had managed to crack the encryption a few hours ago. He tapped the screen, bringing up her final log. A grainy video feed sputtered to life. The woman on the screen was exhausted, her face smeared with grease and soot. Blood stained the collar of her uniform. "If you're watching this, the Concordate won," Hayes said, her voice raspy but defiantly steady. "They didn't beat us in a straight fight. They deployed a radiological sweep, some kind of neutron pulse. It bypassed the kinetic barriers entirely. It doesn't damage the ship. It just kills the meat inside." She coughed, a wet, terrible sound. "The crew is dying, fast. The captain ordered an evacuation, but there's nowhere to go. So, a few of us came down to engineering. We locked the blast doors. We diverted all life support to the central databanks to preserve the ship's memory, and we buried the old girl in the dirt." Hayes leaned closer to the camera. Her eyes were sharp, filled with a cold, desperate fury. "This ship is a forge. It carries the blueprints of everything humanity ever built. Every weapon, every engine, every piece of art. If they find it, they'll scrub it. So we're taking it off the board. If you are human and you are hearing this, wake her up. Remind them that we don't go quietly." The screen went black. Charles stared at his reflection in the dark glass of the datapad. He had spent his whole life keeping his head down, scavenging, surviving, letting the alien syndicates and the Concordate push him into the dirt because that was the natural order of things. He looked around the steel walls of the dreadnought. He felt the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the reactors beneath his feet. "System," Charles said softly. "Plot a course for the nearest inhabited sector. We need to find some friends." The Mary Jane was a flying coffin. It was a cobbled-together freighter, primarily composed of rusted hull plating, exposed wiring, and desperation. At the helm, a man named Miller was sweating profusely, his hands white-knuckling the manual flight yoke. Alarms shrieked through the cramped, foul-smelling cockpit. The tactical screen was flashing a blinding, urgent red. "Come on," Miller pleaded, slamming his fist against the FTL drive initiator. The console sparked, burning his knuckles, but the drive remained stubbornly offline. The main coil was fused. They were dead in the water. Behind them, moving with predatory grace through the blackness of space, was a Concordat corvette. It was named the Axiom of Grace, though there was nothing graceful about what it was about to do. The alien ship was sleek, shaped like a silver teardrop, its surface perfectly smooth and reflecting the distant starlight. The comms channel cracked open, flooded with the crystalline, heavily translated voice of a Concordat patrol captain. "Unregistered human vessel. You are in violation of standard tithe protocols. Your engine signature matches a craft involved in illegal salvage operations in Sector 4. Cut your auxiliary power and prepare for boarding and summary execution." Miller closed his eyes. He had a crew of 4 in the back: scrappers, mechanics, people who just wanted to scrape enough credits together to buy a patch of dirt on a moon somewhere. Now they were going to be vaporized for picking over a derelict satellite. "This is the Mary Jane," Miller croaked into the mic. "We surrender. Take the cargo. Just let us jump to a neutral port." "Negative," the Concordat captain replied, his tone devoid of malice, just a cold, bureaucratic finality. "Execution of vermin is standard protocol. Firing main batteries." Miller braced for the end. He watched the tactical screen as the Corvette's plasma capacitors spiked. A blinding ball of blue fire formed at the tip of the alien ship. Then, the tactical screen went entirely black. Miller blinked. He tapped the glass. The sensors hadn't failed. They were simply overwhelmed. Something had just materialized directly between the Mary Jane and the Concordat corvette. Something so massive it cast a physical shadow over Miller's cockpit, blocking out the stars. On the bridge of the Axiom of Grace, the Concordat captain was thrown against his harness as the corvette's collision alarm screamed. The pilot violently wrenched the ship to starboard, barely avoiding slamming into a solid wall of black metal that had seemingly ripped itself out of slipspace. The alien captain stared through the main viewport, his multiple eyes wide with shock. Hovering in the void was a nightmare of archaic engineering. It was 3 miles of jagged armor plating, bristling with communication spires and heavy kinetic weapon emplacements. Hundreds of blocky, spider-like drones were crawling across its surface, welding plates and repairing scorch marks. It looked like a floating graveyard that had decided to go to war. "Captain," the Concordat sensor officer hissed, his scales pale. "I cannot read its energy signature. The output is... It is impossible. It is using raw fusion, unshielded." "Target it," the captain snapped, recovering his composure. "It is human junk, a bulk freighter modified for intimidation. Target their central mass and fire." Aboard the Vanguard, Charles was eating a bowl of synthesized oatmeal. He watched the sleek silver Corvette bank around on the main holographic display. "Incoming fire detected," the system announced calmly. "Plasma signatures, low yield." 2 brilliant blue plasma bolts streaked through the void, striking the Vanguard squarely on its portside armor. Inside the Dreadnought's command center, the lights flickered once. That was it. no claxons, no shaking. Charles set his bowl down. System, report damage. Port armor plating localized temperature increased by 4 degrees. No structural damage. Kinetic barriers were not required to engage. Charles let out a low, dry chuckle. The Concordat had spent 300 years fighting pirates and unarmed human transports. They built weapons designed to melt civilian shielding. They had completely forgotten what a ship built to take a hit from a dying star felt like. "Open a channel to the Concordat vessel," Charles said. The channel clicked open. Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "This is the United Earth Directorate Forge Dreadnought Vanguard," Charles said, his voice dropping into a dangerous gravelly register. "You just scratched my paint." There was a moment of dead silence on the channel. Then, the Concordat captain's voice came through, edged with a frantic, rising panic. "UED? That is impossible. The human fleets were eradicated. You are a relic. You are a ghost." "Yeah," Charles agreed softly. "And we're haunting this sector now." Charles didn't wait for a reply. He tapped the tactical console. "System, spool up the spinal mount. Magnetic accelerator cannon 1. Load a standard tungsten-depleted uranium slug. Do not bother with tracking fields. Just punch them in the mouth." Deep within the ship, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the empty corridors. Massive magnetic coils, the size of office buildings, engaged in sequence. The power draw was so immense, the internal lights dimmed to an angry red. "Firing," the system stated. There was no beam of light. There was no glowing ball of energy. In the vacuum of space, a physical projectile the size of a school bus was accelerated to 4% the speed of light in a fraction of a second. It struck the Concordat corvette directly center mass. The alien ship's advanced energy shields flashed brilliantly for a microsecond before shattering like glass. The kinetic round didn't explode. It simply punched through the pristine silver hull, entered the engineering deck, and exited out the other side, tearing the ship completely in half through sheer brute force. The two halves of the axiom of grace tumbled away from each other, venting atmosphere, plasma, and debris into the void. Charles watched the wreckage drift on the monitors. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had just crossed a line. There was no going back to scavenging. The Concordat would investigate this. They would send an armada. The comms channel crackled. It was the human ship. "Holy, holy Mother of God," Miller's voice stuttered over the radio. "Who is this? What is that ship?" Charles leaned back in the command chair. He looked at the empty stations around him, waiting for crews that had been dead for 1,000 years. He looked at the red sensor light of the maintenance drone standing silently by the door. "I'm a junk peddler who dug too deep," Charles replied. "Dock your ship in our lower port bay. We've got plenty of room, and we need the hands. The factory is open for business." The Mary Jane didn't land in the Vanguard's port hangar. It was swallowed by it. Miller cut his engines, letting the dreadnought's massive tractor beams guide his battered freighter down onto a landing pad the size of a city block. As the heavy airlock doors sealed and the bay pressurized, Miller and his crew stepped out onto the cold iron deck. They didn't speak. They just stared. Hundreds of maintenance drones scuttled past them, dragging thick coils of power, cabling, and welding torches. Automated cranes hoisted massive, freshly forged armor plates toward the ceiling. The air smelled of ozone, molten slag, and hot grease. It was an industrial cathedral, and the congregation was made of steel. Charles met them at the base of a gantry. He didn't look like a savior. His face was smeared with engine soot. His knuckles were bruised, and he was still wearing his scuffed scavenger harness. "Welcome aboard," Charles said, tossing a heavy wrench between his hands. "I need 3 of you in water reclamation, and 1 of you who knows how to calibrate targeting sensors. The automated systems are fast, but they lack imagination." Miller swallowed hard. "Charles, you know what you just did? You killed a Concordate patrol. They don't send tickets for that. They send armadas." "I know," Charles said. He turned, looking down the length of the cavernous hangar. "That's why we need more hands. Send out a tight beam burst on the encrypted scavenger frequencies. Tell them there's safe harbor. Tell them the forge is lit." The message went out in the dark. A digital whisper passed from rusted relay stations to illegal mining outposts. It was a simple code, a myth the older scavengers used to tell over cheap synthale. "The anvil is ringing." Within 48 hours, the void around the Vanguard began to warp. It started with a trickle. 2 ragged asteroid hoppers limped out of slipspace, their hulls patched with scrap metal, engines sputtering. Then a heavy salvage barge, carrying a crew of 50 desperate humans who had been on the run from Krillari debt collectors. Then came the smugglers, the rogue miners, the outcasts. They poured into the Vanguard's colossal hangars like refugees fleeing a storm. For the first time in centuries, humanity wasn't hiding. They were gathering. Charles stood on the command deck, watching the internal feeds. The ship was transforming. The empty, silent corridors were suddenly full of noise, human voices echoing off the steel bulkheads, mechanics arguing over engine schematics, children, born in the orbital slums, running wide-eyed through hydroponics bays that were rapidly filling with engineered green soil. But Charles wasn't running a charity. He was preparing for a war. The Vanguard's factory decks roared to life. He set the matter converters to maximum yield. The dreadnought swallowed asteroids whole, stripping them of iron, titanium, and carbon, and spat out weapons. Charles had the automated cranes pull the civilian ships apart. He didn't ask permission. The scavengers watched in awe as the Vanguard's mechanical arms ripped the civilian thrusters off their rust buckets and replaced them with UED military-grade ion drives. They bolted thick, kinetic-absorbing ablative armor over fragile cockpits. They welded railgun turrets onto mining barges. He wasn't just fixing their ships. He was turning a fleet of garbage trucks into a Vanguard. "System," Charles called out, pacing the bridge. "Status on the strike craft Q." "Fabrication complete," the emotionless voice responded. 200 Manticore-class heavy fighters are fueled and sitting in dorsal launch bays, awaiting pilots. Charles tapped his comms earpiece. "Miller, you said you used to fly escort for the inter-system convoys before you went bust. How quickly can you train these junk runners to fly a UED fighter?" "Charles," Miller's voice crackled, breathless and frantic. "These people are miners, scrappers. Half of them don't know the difference between a targeting array and a toaster." "Teach them," Charles said coldly, "because the toaster doesn't shoot back, and we're out of time." The tactical display at the center of the room chimed. It wasn't a soft, warning ping. It was a harsh, rhythmic klaxon. The holographic map of the local sector shifted to a deep, angry crimson. "Multiple slipspace ruptures detected," the system announced. "Designation, Concordate Armada. Capital class signatures confirmed. Estimated time to real space translation, 4 minutes." Charles stopped pacing. He looked out the massive armor-glass viewport into the empty blackness of space. He felt the familiar, cold grip of fear in his gut. The instinct to run. The instinct that had kept him alive his entire life. He swallowed it. He gripped the edge of the command console until his knuckles popped. "Battle stations," Charles said. He hit the ship-wide broadcast switch. "Listen up. Every human on this ship. The Concordat is here. They expect to find a scavenger running a derelict. They expect to wipe us out, strip this ship, and go back to treating us like dirt." The hum of the dreadnought seemed to deepen, a low growl vibrating through the deck plates. "We are not scavengers today," Charles's voice echoed through the sprawling hangars, the factory decks, and the cramped cockpits of the retrofitted fleet. "This ship was built to hold the line, so that's what we're going to do. We hold the line." Space tore open. It wasn't a clean entry. The sheer mass of the Concordat armada ripping out of slipspace sent a gravitational shockwave rolling across the void, shaking the Vanguard violently. Charles stood firm on the bridge, his eyes locked on the tactical screen. 30 alien warships materialized. They were pristine, terrifying, and aggressively beautiful. 3 massive cruisers, flanked by a dozen destroyers and a swarm of fast-attack frigates. Their hulls were pale gold and silver, reflecting the distant starlight like drawn swords. They arranged themselves in a sweeping crescent formation, a perfect hunter's net. A communication request forced its way through the Vanguard's firewalls. Charles let it connect. The face of a Concordat fleetmaster appeared on the primary screen. He was clad in ceremonial armor, his narrow, angular face expressing profound disgust. "Human parasite," the alien sneered, his translated voice sharp like cracking glass. "You trespass in a graveyard. Power down that relic's core and open your airlocks. Your execution will be clean. Defy us, and we will boil you inside that iron shell." Charles didn't blink. He reached over and picked up the heavy wrench he'd been carrying since the hangar. He tapped it twice against the steel console. Clack, clack. "System," Charles said, ignoring the alien entirely. "Divert all secondary power to the kinetic barriers. Open the dorsal launch tubes. Let the dogs out." He cut the channel. The fleetmaster didn't hesitate. The Concordat armada opened fire. Space ignited. Hundreds of concentrated plasma beams lanced across the void. A blinding storm of blue and purple fire aimed squarely at the Vanguard. "Impact in 3 seconds, the system warned. "Brace for kinetic shock." The dreadnought shuddered as the volley struck. The UED kinetic barriers, unseen in the galaxy for centuries, flared to life. They didn't deflect the energy. They absorbed it, rippling with bright, violent amber light. The noise inside the ship was deafening, a continuous grinding roar like standing under a waterfall of steel. The lights on the bridge flickered. The temperature spiked. "Barrier integrity at 80%, the system reported over the din. "Minor thermal bleed in lower quadrants." Charles grinned savagely. The old girl could take a punch. "Return fire, magnetic accelerators 1 through 4. Target the cruisers, fire at will." The Vanguard didn't shoot lasers. It shot physics. 4 spinal-mounted cannons fired in rapid succession. The recoil pushed the 3-mile-long dreadnought backward by several meters. Massive slugs of dense matter tore across the battlefield. They were invisible to the naked eye, moving too fast. One of the Concordat cruisers abruptly shattered. There was no explosion, just a sudden, violent kinetic disassembly as the uranium slug cored the ship from bow to stern. Debris rained outward, slamming into the adjacent alien frigates. The concordate formation broke, scattering like panicked fish. They had never fought a ship that relied on brute force ballistics. "Miller, you're up," Charles barked into the comms. "Hit their flanks." From the cavernous hangars and launch tubes of the Vanguard, the human fleet poured out. 200 Manticore fighters, blocky and heavily armored, swarmed into the void. Behind them came the retrofitted garbage trucks, mining barges bristling with welded-on railguns. They flew with no elegance, no pristine formations. They flew like desperate scavengers fighting for their lives. Miller led the charge, his comms channel an open mic of screaming, adrenaline-fueled miners. The UED fighters didn't bother stripping alien shields from a distance. They closed the gap, burying themselves inside the Concordate frigate's defensive perimeters, and unleashed point-blank barrages of rotary cannon fire. Alien ships began to burn. The pristine gold and silver hulls were scarred, punctured, and vented into the vacuum. But there were too many. A Concordate destroyer broke through the fighter screen, accelerating directly toward the Vanguard. Its forward plasma lance charged, a blinding star of concentrated heat. "Warning, high-yield thermal spike detected," the system chimed. "Kinetic barriers cannot absorb direct impact at this range." "Don't absorb it," Charles shouted. "Ram them." "Confirm?" "Ram them!" The Vanguard's main thrusters flared. Millions of tons of dark, heavy metal surged forward. The Concordate destroyer fired, a beam of pure heat searing across the Vanguard's port bow, melting armor, plating to liquid slag. But the dreadnought didn't stop. The Vanguard slammed into the alien destroyer. The sound of the collision tore through the deck plates, throwing Charles to the floor. The dreadnought's prow, designed to break through orbital defense grids, crushed the alien vessel. The Concordate ship crumpled against the UED armor like a tin can under a boot, its engines detonating in a silent flash of expanding gas. Charles pulled himself up, coughing as smoke filled the bridge. Sirens were blaring. Half the tactical screens were shattered, but the display still showed the battle. The Concordate armada was retreating. The remaining cruisers were spinning up their slipspace drives, fleeing from the hulking, bruised monster they had awakened. The human fighters were cheering over the open comms, a chaotic, ragged chorus of laughter and disbelief. Charles slumped heavily into the command chair. He looked at the scarred, blackened armor of his ship projected on the monitor. They had won. They had bloodied the nose of the galaxy's masters. He keyed the ship's long-range broadcast array. He set it to repeat on every open frequency in the sector. "This is the United Earth Directorate ship Vanguard," Charles said, his voice exhausted but unyielding. "To the Concordate, consider this your eviction notice. And to any human out there scraping by in the dark." Charles smiled, watching the stars shine through the smoke of the battlefield. "Look up. We're home." If you felt the sheer kinetic impact of the Vanguard holding the line, smash that like button and share this story with anyone who loves seeing humanity fight back against the odds. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what Charles and his ragtag fleet do next, now that the galaxy knows they're awake. Drop a comment below. What would you name a retrofitted mining barge armed with UED railguns? The Concordate War has only just begun. Keep looking up, and I'll see you in the next transmission.